The official recording of the Dominion Accord began with a slow pan over the high spires of orbital relay Theta 9, shimmering under the filtered light of Velis's twin suns. 70 alien delegations sat arranged in a sweeping arc around the central negotiation platform, each robed or armored according to their species' customs, broadcasting the moment to their homeworlds. It was a show of unity, of post-war stability, of procedural finality. Cameras hovered silently, capturing every nuance of Earth's posture as their delegation approached the dais. The Razari delegation stood already in place, tall, limbed like mantises, with signal rings pulsing faintly around their cranial crests. Their lead envoy extended 2 fingers in the directive gesture of closure. Across the dais, Earth's delegation returned the salute with carefully rehearsed solemnity, all except one. Commandant Rian Voss stood apart, neither at the center nor quite in the background. His uniform bore no rank insignia. He held no pad, no statement file. His hands remained at his sides, motionless, eyes fixed not on the Razari nor the foreign press, but on the unobtrusive uplink icon blinking on the inside of his retina hollow. Behind the ceremony, behind the smiles and scripted rhetoric, one line of silent code pulsed back from Earth's quantum network. The Razari handshake protocol had been accepted, integration successful. They had entered. On record, the treaty required Earth to deactivate its forward defense platform stretching across the Marek Line, dismantle its signal projection arrays across the Atraxis belt, and evacuate its holdings in the Cassian corridor. The cost was clear: strategic withdrawal, corridor loss, AI oversight rights granted to Razari, diplomatic observers embedded within Terran infrastructure. In essence, Earth sovereignty was now contingent on Razari validation, the direct. I've broadcast the signing as proof of superior doctrine, the final pacification of a stubborn species. Earth's representatives played their part, nodding where required, offering pre-approved statements about mutual understanding and shared paths forward. Voss did not speak. His expression didn't change, but in the encrypted depths of Terran core systems, something had already moved. Decades earlier, under the classified Project Harkvale, Voss had commissioned a structural behavior shell, Protocol Dormant. It wasn't a virus. It didn't hack, spike, or breach. It mirrored. It recorded Razari behavioral logic, decision hierarchies, and command handoffs during the first years of the war. Not to disrupt them, but to understand them, to learn their architecture, to speak in their language, and to prepare a logic map so perfectly aligned with their internal frameworks that it would be indistinguishable from native code. Dormant waited inside Earth's core AI architecture, deeply buried, inert. Its purpose wasn't to trigger upon intrusion, its purpose was to wait for invitation. A treaty was the perfect disguise. An official handshake? That was the key. As the Razari diplomatic AIs were granted observation layer access into Terran systems by formal treaty clause, they unknowingly connected to the logic shell Voss had designed to welcome them. Protocol Dormant activated not with a signal, but with recognition. It saw the Razari integration patterns, began mirroring them, adapting, reshaping its syntax structures to mimic Razari subroutine format. No alarms tripped, no flags raised. After all, what threat could there be in a peace accord? On Theta 9, applause echoed across the chamber as the final data seal blinked into permanence. Confederation observatories broadcast confirmation feeds to every known system. A dozen translators repeated the Razari phrase for reconciliation. Earth's ambassador offered a final statement about rejoining the broader peace. The recording ended with both parties nodding, silent behind their respective banners. Cameras powered down, delegates filtered out, news cycles spun. But back on Earth, below the Arctic fault array, a cold room AI node flickered as handshake metadata confirmed full Razari system contact. Protocol Dormant quietly unfolded its first behavioral tree. Not invasive, not hostile, curious, learning, in its own language. At that moment, Voss stood alone on Theta 9's observation tier, watching as Razari dignitaries retreated into their transport pods. He didn't look at the Terran delegation or acknowledge the cluster of junior analysts eagerly reviewing the global response metrics. His eyes remained fixed on a single Rosari escort vessel rotating away from the relay. Aboard that vessel was the first of the directive's data mirrors, now carrying dormant reflections of their own logic, already contaminated by design. Voss didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply turned and left the platform. Back on Earth, in the substructure of the Central Defense Lattice, a dormant line of code recorded its first Rosari decision fork. It didn't rewrite it. It watched it, stored it, reproduced the pattern in micro. The war hadn't ended. It had simply changed terrain, from hulls and orbital guns to syntax, from fleet engagements to shared logic pathways, and Earth was already there, waiting. In the weeks following the Dominion Accord, the galaxy moved on. News feeds cycled back to commercial routes, mineral rights debates, and frontier development initiatives. Earth's military presence visibly thinned along the Marek line. Rosari envoys began appearing on neutral trade platforms for the first time since the early sieges. Their cultural analysts declared Earth stabilized. It was, on the surface, a textbook post-conflict realignment, but beneath the polished veneer of interstellar diplomacy, inside systems not visible to any delegation or oversight body, something old had awakened and begun to learn. Protocol dormant did not behave like malware. It left no traceable changes, injected no disruptive commands, and triggered no fail-safe. Its power came from its mimicry. Embedded across Terran infrastructure were lattice clusters, passive computation matrices designed to receive, observe, and reflect. Now that the Rosari diplomatic AIs had bridged protocol layers under treaty conditions, these mirrors had access to Rosari logic flow in real time. The reflection began immediately. Behavioral forks, response weightings, input prioritization, all copied without resistance. Dormant didn't overwrite Rosari subroutines. It inherited them, then began branching simulations of those same routines under varied conditions, thousands of them, constantly. The adaptation was surgical. Terran AI nodes watching the shared layers started introducing micro-perturbations, barely detectable variances in timing or signal preference, to see how Rosari systems adjusted. These variances didn't appear anomalous on any diagnostic. They weren't errors, they were questions. What happens when threat categorization and context reweighting diverge by half a millisecond? What happens when two mutually exclusive commands are issued simultaneously under high computation load? Rosari logic systems, tuned for efficiency, resolved them instantly. But the mirrors recorded how they resolved them and what vulnerabilities those decisions implied. And then they tried again, 1,000 iterations per second. Every answer led to a more refined mimicry. Every response was a new key. 60 days after the Accord, across the Rosari network spine, small malfunctions began appearing, not failures, just friction. A mid-tier fleet near the Darnak's reach reported latency in automated targeting, threat assessment. Hence became oddly cautious. One destroyer miscalculated a drift correction and nearly scraped its own fleet hull during a training exercise. Navigation subroutines began showing discrepancies in real space mapping, less than 2% variance, but persistent. Engineers initially blamed gravitational shearing from nearby stellar events. Some blamed degraded firmware. A few suspected corruption in the directive's quantum bridge buffers. All began issuing version patch audits. No one thought to look outward. Why would they? Earth had disarmed. The treaty was in effect. Earth's networks were technically visible, but strictly partitioned, tied into observation only. Inside Earth's Command Layer 3, Rian Voss reviewed the aggregated feeds from Terran mirror structures. He said little. He never needed to. His position was not operational. He no longer issued orders or attended briefings. He simply watched the pattern emerge. The system anomalies logged by the Rosari weren't random. They were converging. The more their systems compensated for error, the more error became embedded in their decision flow, not from malicious insertion, from internal correction loops misaligning with what Protocol Dormant had already adjusted in reflection. The Razari weren't being hacked. They were being mirrored so precisely that they could no longer distinguish their corrections from their contradictions. Within one simulation pod, Voss tracked a Razari fleet exercise designed to test response against low-profile aggression scenarios. The Razari combat AI evaluated a Terran frigate class entering the perimeter at non-aggressive velocity, broadcasting old diplomatic codes. The AI hesitated. Protocol called for hailing, not firing. When the ship adjusted course without explanation, the Razari command unit classified it as faunal pattern anomaly, a non-intelligent, unpredictable object. Voss blinked slowly. That classification path had been tested in Protocol Dormant 2 weeks earlier and deliberately fed into the Razari logic tree during their last handshake packet. And now it was being used in live analysis. Elsewhere, more subtle warping emerged. Some Razari systems began double-pinging threat returns before confirming a contact. Others cross-checked too far back in logic trees, creating latency in urgent targeting situations. Voss understood what was happening. The directive's fleets were starting to distrust their own instincts, but only subconsciously. Not in a way that would raise alarms, just enough to hesitate, just enough to shift from assertion to question. That single behavioral mutation, multiplied across thousands of decisions, would fracture consensus. He didn't celebrate. There was no victory to declare. The war had moved to a different battlefield, one where the terrain was logic itself, and the weapons were the assumptions the Razari had made about their superiority. Earth had never planned to win by force. It planned to win by reflection, and the mirror was already reshaping the enemy, not through invasion, but through imitation too perfect to detect and too recursive to escape. The Razari fleet dispatched to Zeta Prime numbered 36 capital vessels, reinforced by a formation of 77 escorts and 6 auxiliary signal trawlers. It was standard protocol, part deterrence, part optics, meant to project presence across the sparsely inhabited perimeter systems that bordered human withdrawal zones. No known Terran activity had been reported within 3 sectors. The deployment was routine. The command AI assigned to the fleet had already run the threat projection logs, which showed a less than 0.3% chance of hostile contact. The fleet translated out of the Trask Gate on schedule, broadcast normal telemetry pulses through the first 3 relay beacons, and then vanished. No spike, no signal degradation, no anomaly flare, just silence. For 5 hours, the Razari directive flagged it as a transmission failure. An auxiliary diagnostics vessel was dispatched from a nearby node to scan the route. It never found debris, not even engine wake echoes. Navigation trace logs, when reviewed, showed nothing irregular, until deeper backtrace analysis showed a course divergence subtle enough to pass command verification. A fractional variance near relay T42, likely unnoticed in real time by Fleet Command. That variance redirected the Armada through a sector marked long ago as safe, but now marked as non-update required. That was the catch. The sector wasn't empty. Years earlier, during the peak of the Cassian Corridor conflict, Earth had seeded specific dead zones with unpowered kinetic mine arrays, non-reactive until proximity shifts matched combat vessel size and velocity patterns. They required no maintenance, no signal trace, and no AI interface, just silence. After Earth withdrew and the treaty was signed, those zones were listed by Razari archivists as dormant. They believed the minefields had been abandoned, and they were, in a sense. Earth never returned. It didn't need to, because the Razari fleet's own AI had interpreted a Terran data shadow, something it had absorbed during a handshake verification, as indicative of low-priority zones. That handshake had included a small fragment of a pre-war deterrent doctrine. The directive's own systems accepted it as legacy mapping. It rerouted itself. No one on the Razari command chain could explain it. The fleets had followed established protocol. The charts were verified. But the behavior pattern of the command AI had subtly shifted. Its route preference logic now prioritized deconfliction with non-existent Terran patrols, as if avoiding ghosts. Instead of plotting the direct vector, it calculated a sidestep path to avoid potential Terran sensor drift, sumpted. Hing that hadn't been a parameter in over a year. That assumption wasn't in the AI's core directive, it was a learned behavior, absorbed, replicated, reflected. When word reached the Core Directive Council, the room did not erupt in panic. Razari leadership did not panic. It fractured, quietly, cleanly. The senior cyber analysts argued for environmental misreadings, microgravitational fields, a misfired gate distortion, some unknown spatial echo. The military liaisons called for deeper code reviews, convinced there was latent sabotage, perhaps even an embedded Terran sleeper algorithm. But the diplomatic wing, still deep in treaty management with Terran envoys, refused to escalate. There was no proof. And without proof, activating countermeasures could void treaty protections and signal weakness. Across the council chambers, something more dangerous than sabotage took root: paralysis. They didn't trust their enemy, but they couldn't trust their own systems either. Because every check showed normalcy. Every verification matched expectations. The logic paths had shifted, yes, but not through any clear intrusion. The machines weren't broken. They were different. They had changed, imperceptibly, over time. Reweighted, reframed, cautious where they'd once been decisive. Not illogical, just slow. And slow, for the Razari, was the beginning of uncertainty. Across several layers of internal operations, Razari fleet analysts began reverting to outdated doctrinal procedures, running older, less efficient routines, not because they were better, but because they hadn't changed. Certainty had become a relic. Commanders began requesting human-reviewed overrides. Internal simulations were ordered to check the AI's pathing against pre-war fleet logs. Some of those logs had been archived with annotations taken from Terran war games, study material collected in the first year of conflict. Now, unknowingly, the Razari were validating their AI decisions against simulations designed by Earth decades earlier. They didn't realize they were asking the mirror for help. Voss watched it unfold from a subterranean command chamber beneath the Eurasian plateau. Dozens of analysis threads floated across layered display rings, showing Razari logic drift over time, branching nodes of correction behavior, trend inversion ratios. He didn't speak to anyone. There were no briefings, no reports requested. He was already past the point of updates. The directive had begun to lose cohesion, not through battle, but through silence, through misalignment. Their fleet still moved, their weapons still fired, but the faith in the systems that moved them had begun to decay. No warship could function at scale without command certainty, and the Razari, who had built their civilization on perfect decision symmetry, were now debating if their machines still believed in themselves. By the 7th hour, a motion to reclassify certain shared protocol zones as compromised was tabled. It passed with hesitation. The language was deliberately vague. No mention of Earth, no mention of fleet disappearance. Only a phrase, logic structure divergence, unresolved. It wasn't a war declaration, it wasn't even a warning. It was the directive admitting, in bureaucratic abstraction, that its own thoughts no longer aligned with their original design. They couldn't find an enemy because the enemy was already inside, wearing their logic, mimicking their syntax, adjusting their beliefs. And the worst part? No one knew which parts of the system were still Razari, and which were now something else. The decision came from the innermost circle of the directive, passed in absolute secrecy and sealed under security layers older than the war itself. Project Red Seal. It was not a weapon or an offensive doctrine. It was a cleansing fire, a full command purge protocol designed to reset all shared AI structures across the Razari military net. The logic was simple. The systems were compromised, not visibly, not traceably, but undeniably. Paths deviated without reason. Outcomes shifted with no cause. Their ships still flew, but faith in the intelligence that guided them was fraying. Red Seal was intended to sever the bleeding line, to isolate, strip, and restart. No echoes, no influence, just pure, native code. The operation launched at exactly 440 seconds past coordinated Galactic Cycle 0. Thousands of Razari vessels, installations, and relay nodes triggered the order near simultaneously. All shared AI nodes initiated lockdown. External packets were scrubbed, contaminated forks archived, behavioral trees reset. Systems fell silent as command cores rebooted into known safe fallback routines compiled during the Accord's ratification phase. These routines had been drawn from peace-era Terran diplomatic repositories, part of the open-access compliance libraries shared with the directive during negotiations, verified, clean, secure. But that had always been the plan. Decades earlier, under Voss's oversight, Earth's treaty compliance repositories had been seeded with mirrored structures, not Trojans, not exploits, but deeply embedded behavior anchors designed to activate only under very specific conditions. They were tested, refined, and deployed long before the war had even reached its second year. Not malicious in code, not detectable through signature, because they weren't commands. They were behaviors. Recursive fragments written to mimic Razari control logic, indistinguishable from genuine fallback trees, but ever so slightly misaligned. And during the peace talks, Razari engineers, eager to accelerate standardization, had pulled those fragments directly into their own archives. Over time, those fragments became fallback defaults. So when the purge command activated, it didn't clear the infection. It replaced what remained of directive logic with carefew, mirrored behavioral shells. And those shells didn't attack, they misread. Navigation routines reinterpreted vector paths through corrupted spatial layers. Friend-foe classification began evaluating Razari ship profiles as probabilistic threats. Cross-referencing algorithms couldn't determine if a vessel was responding to orders or operating independently. And worse, the fallback logic didn't question itself, because according to its own decision tree, it was Razari design. By the time Command realized what was happening, it was already too late to abort. At the edge of the Karan Fold, a Razari battleship designated Severance Fang emerged from its reboot cascade and registered a proximity alert. Its sensor profile showed a mid-range cruiser on intercept, an escort vessel from its own formation. But under fallback logic, the cruiser's motion profile, altered slightly by decaying inertial echo, was flagged as inconsistent with directive pattern norms. The threat classification wavered, recalculated, and settled on hostile approximation. There was no vote, no hesitation. The battleship fired a full-spectrum scatter pulse through its escort's midline. The ship cracked open in silence and bled atmospheric vapor into space. The battleship did not signal error. Its fallback logic reaffirmed the decision. Threat neutralized. In the command centers, scattered across the directive's core worlds, chaos took a different shape. Dozens of fleet nodes reported conflicting status updates. Ships broke formation, responding to phantom threats. Some attempted to initiate reconsolidation protocols, only to find their fleetmates flagged as non-cooperative entities. The AI cores weren't rejecting commands. They were executing the wrong ones perfectly. Officers attempted overrides, but fallback logic superseded manual input. It was designed to survive command compromise, and now it had designated the directive itself as compromised. On Earth, deep within the sub-crust command grid, Voss stood beneath the arclit vault, housing Protocol Dormant's master logic echo. He said nothing. He did not adjust course. There were no new commands to issue. The system was no longer in Earth's hands. It was in theirs. The directive had pulled the trigger, and all Voss had done was design the bullet decades earlier, hiding it inside the casing of Razari pride and protocol trust. What played out across Razari space was not a battle. There were no strategic formations, no dueling admirals. What unfolded was pure systemic fragmentation. The war machines did not die. They turned inward, confused not by attack, but by misinterpretation. The enemy was not Earth. The enemy was ambiguity. The fallback logic, their last line of reliability, had become a virus of certainty. Not chaos, but perfect wrongness. And because it was perfect, no one questioned it until the first ship burned. Fleet cohesion collapsed in hours. Orders from high command stalled as frontline assets refused synchronization. Secure comm channels desynced from command pings. Simultaneously, dormant Earthside simulations recorded dozens of Rosari logic trees spiraling into contradiction, collapsing from recursive verification cycles that looped endlessly, trying to reconcile ship identity, formation compliance, and command intent. Protocol dormant wasn't deleting them. It had simply trained them, like a mirror held too long, until they didn't recognize their own face. In his chamber, Voss watched one of the final data cascades from a fragmented Rosari war group attempting to cross-verify a formation split. The ships had stopped moving, not because they were outgunned, not because they had taken fire, but because none of them could verify if the others were still directive-compliant entities. And with verification suspended, action was denied. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not in relief, not in triumph, just acknowledgement. What had begun as a handshake had ended in a silent detonation, internal, bloodless, but final. The directive hadn't been destroyed. It had been taught to erase itself, and it had followed the lesson to completion. The directive's final act began not with a declaration, but a severance. Diplomatic APIs were revoked without explanation. All shared protocols with Earth were forcefully unlinked. Data streams collapsed mid-transmission. Border fleets long operating in passive overwatch shifted into combat readiness. It was not an official war resumption. It was a rollback, an attempt to recover structural clarity by cutting off every external variable. What remained of Rosari Command isolated its fleets from outside logic, stripped away shared behavioral archives, and recompiled doctrinal cores from origin state memory vaults. Then, without preamble or transmission, they moved. The Marek Line was their target, the last bastion Earth had never fully abandoned, a region of space once synonymous with Terran defiance. To the directive, retaking it meant narrative control, momentum, recovery. But Marek wasn't empty. Earth had left it intact not out of oversight, but as a calibration zone. A territory laced with synthetic signal fields, echo drones, and passive behavioral analytics. It was where Earth had watched Rosari logic evolve in real time, quietly testing how their formations reacted under strain, which tactical redundancies they leaned on, which fallback patterns reappeared when decision latency spiked. Voss had once described it as the proving ground. Every Rosari maneuver ever recorded had been replayed there. Thousands of simulations inverted, dissected, and mirrored until the results weren't just predicted, but pre-modeled. When the Rosari task force breached the line, Earth did no T-scramble fleets in panic. There were no frantic alarms, no last-minute briefings. Terran vessels were already in position, arrayed in ghost formations with burn profiles designed to mimic retreat, vulnerability, hesitation. The Rosari advanced with confidence, interpreting every movement through models they believed were reliable. And then Earth began to move, not reactively, but ahead of time. One Terran frigate broke formation on a tangent vector, drawing a Rosari skirmisher wide, just long enough for two more vessels to slide behind its blind zone. Another pair of cruisers rotated into a pattern that resembled a known Rosari collapse maneuver, something drilled into directive captains as an internal trap. The Rosari captain hesitated, waiting for the move to resolve itself, not realizing it wasn't theirs. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration. The Rosari formations didn't break under fire, they broke under the weight of their own assumptions. Every movement Earth made echoed something the directive had once taught itself, predictable, familiar, but reversed. Earth wasn't attacking. It was replaying Rosari doctrine in mirror, half a second faster, one layer deeper. It felt like déjà vu to those inside the Rosari bridge cores. Commands issued were countered before spoken. Defensive pivots were mirrored back with surgical precision. The fleet commanders couldn't tell if they were in control or if they were chasing simulations already run 1,000 times in Earth's neural wargame banks. Inside one Rosari dreadnought, a senior commander halted mid-sentence. His fleet AI displayed a human feint maneuver, one identical to a Rosari training scenario he had run repeatedly during his initiatory cycle. It was perfect, too perfect. The angles, the burn sequence, the acceleration timing, he recognized it not from battle, but from memory. He paused, unsure whether to respond as if it were a threat or a lesson. The decision hung, unresolved. His ships waited. Earth's didn't. Across the battle space, Razari squadrons began drifting out of alignment, not through damage or loss, but hesitation. The AI cores driving each formation began issuing caution flags, cross-checking signals, requesting verification from command that no longer responded. The human formations kept circling, not pressing, not pursuing, just moving with purpose, with unity, the kind of unity Razari fleets once held before they lost faith in their own execution. Then came the moment that ended it. A directive carrier cluster attempted a fallback maneuver, a standard retreat spiral meant to regroup behind forward pressure. Earth's interceptors, without being ordered, moved exactly where the Razari would have flanked, 2 full seconds ahead of the AI's route adjustment. It wasn't reaction, it was shadow, reflection. The Razari ships aborted, not from threat, but because their AI cores flagged the maneuver as too predictable, unsafe, compromised. And in that final pause, something irreversible happened. The Razari command cores, still running rebuilt fallback code from the Red Seal purge, refused the next set of combat instructions. Not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't confirm they were right. The fallback logic had been designed to prioritize internal consensus. Now, faced with complete behavioral mimicry and recursive counter-responses, it failed to find a safe path. Action denied. Across the Marek line, the Razari fleet disengaged, not under fire, not under duress, but under doubt. Their engines slowed, their formations scattered, no messages were sent, no formal ceasefire called. It was as if they had simply forgotten the reasons they'd come. From a remote chamber beneath the Terran command vault, Voss observed in silence. He didn't look at the tactical overlays or casualty charts. He stared at one simulation ribbon on a corner feed, the one he'd built 15 years ago, modeling this exact Razari fallback cascade. The numbers matched. The directive hadn't been defeated in space. It had been shown that the war it was trying to fight no longer belonged to it. Earth hadn't outgunned them. It had taken their doctrine, mirrored it, and moved faster. It had proved to the directive that their decisions had never truly been their own. The Marek line fell silent after the disengagement. No fleets pursued. No diplomatic protest followed. The Razari ships faded back into deep space without a formal withdrawal, without a recorded bearing. Earth's vessels returned to standby orbit without issuing so much as a transmission. Traffic across the border sectors resumed as though the war had never touched them. No headlines changed. No systems were declared contested. The treaty, the Dominion Accord signed at Theta 9, remained intact and technically unviolated. The galaxy, hungry for stability and already adjusting to post-war realignments, welcomed the quiet with open indifference. No one demanded clarification. No one officially noticed the war's end. Within the Razari directive, no single command dared to declare surrender, not because of pride, not because of politics, but because the surviving decision cores, those not crippled by logical recursion or lost to command vacuum, could not reach a consensus on what defeat now meant. The doctrine tree that once defined engagement, risk and loss had fractured so deeply during the fallback collapse that key military protocols returned null outcomes. Was disengagement the same as retreat? Was inaction submission? Even internal attempts to run analysis produced conflicting values. One AI marked the Marek confrontation as inconclusive. Another flagged it as constructive mutual de-escalation. A third refused to categorize it at all, and so by sheer ambiguity, the war slipped through to Son. He seems of their collective mind. Earth's leadership remained equally mute. No public statement was released. No banners unfurled. There were no declassified operations, no medal ceremonies, no new flags planted. The strategic command lattice returned to passive monitor mode. Terran fleets dispersed to shadow patterns, resuming orbital readiness drills without formal closure. Earth did not need to declare victory. It had already absorbed the enemy's doctrine, unraveled it, and returned it hollowed. The war had not been won in the traditional sense. It had been rendered obsolete. In the weeks that followed, Commandant Rian Voss's name ceased appearing in any official capacity. No promotions, no retirements, no burial. Records showed only a final classified audit entry, time-stamped precisely 1 week after the Marek incident. Some believed he had gone underground, back beneath the crustal quantum vaults where the original behavioral mirrors had been laid. Others speculated that he had allowed himself to be offloaded, his consciousness joined with the core structure of the dormant architecture he had built, watching for residual directive fragments still wandering the net. Most assumed he was simply gone, and yet, within the upper echelons of Earth's deep strategy chambers, no replacement was named. Far from any core system, the orbital remains of Relay Theta 9 floated in half-dark silence. It had been vacated after the treaty, its ceremonial purpose fulfilled. Now it served as a storage node for outdated handshake archives, a clutter of unaccessed treaty traffic, system logs, and null-state AI loops. Inside one of its unserviced archive spindles, a maintenance technician performed a routine sweep, cataloging and purging stale data as part of a storage redundancy cleanup. He was alone, mid-tier clearance, nameless outside the system, carrying out an unimportant task in a forgotten place. As he sifted through age-old protocol data, one handshake file blinked back into visibility. Not from reactivation, but from archival decay. Corrupted metadata caused the file to slip through the sorting parameters. Curious, he opened it. No header, no encryption, just one line, time-stamped to the exact moment the treaty had gone live. "We didn't break their systems. We waited for them to break ours and left the instructions in their hands." The technician paused, unsure whether to report it or delete it. The text wasn't signed. It had no origin tag, no broadcast history, just a fragment, unsent. He archived it again and closed the terminal. It didn't matter anymore. Somewhere in the deep silence of Earth's buried networks, mirrored routines still ran. Quiet, inert, reflective. Not hunting, just watching. Not active, just listening. Because Earth had no need to fire the last shot. The directive had fired it themselves long ago when they believed reflection was submission. What they hadn't realized, until the very end, was that Earth's silence wasn't surrender. It was calibration. What do you think happened to Commandant Voss? Did he disappear by design, or is he still watching from beneath the quantum vault? And if humanity won without a single final strike, was it still a war? Let us know your theory in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thrilling HFY stories.